Earl Sweatshirt is a rapper from Chicago, Illinois, who has been around for pretty much the entirety of this decade, back when Tyler the Creator decided to invite him into the Odd Future camp. And ever since then, Earl Sweatshirt was able to, make a come up in his own independent music with his mixtape, the 2010 mixtape, Earl. Then going on to his 2013 album, Doris. And then 2015, I would say, was the peak of his career with I Don't Like Shit, I Don't Go Outside. It was finally the point where I could say I genuinely appreciated his sound and style and aesthetic, because prior to that I wasn't really a huge fan of Earl's music, unfortunately. But it actually took a few years to realize the amount of detail and great depth of what was put into I Don't Like Shit, I Don't Go Outside. At the time I liked it, but honestly I think as years have gone by I can truly say I genuinely do love this album. And so from then on, people have been hyping up a new Earl Sweatshirt release to the point where it seemed as though at one point people were ready to go into a new Earl album, calling it an instant classic like a lot of the early hip-hop heads tend to do. A very common thing in the hip-hop world, to be honest, and it was something that I was a bit worried about. Would I go into this album thinking way too highly of it before going into it because of the reception it would receive instantaneously? Would it actually live up to the expectations, live up to the hype that people have been hoping for a good few years now? In fairness to Earl, he has gone through a lot of personal tragedies in this time between I Don't Like Shit and some rap songs, so it's no surprise that it has taken quite a few years for him to drop this album. A couple of weeks back, when we got the single Nowhere to Go, I did a reaction to it. Probably not the best track to react to because it was so short and didn't really give off a certain single vibe going into an album. It wasn't your typical single that any artist would drop right before an album, but as Earl did state, he's not a singles artist guy, so what do I drop if I'm not a singles artist guy? What do I drop? So I'm just going to drop this one because this is the one that sounds most like a single, as he said. But then the official track listing came out and I was honestly a little worried. I saw 15 tracks, 24 minutes. I was instantly kind of ringing alarm bells, to be honest. I was like, oh no, is this just going to be a really, brief album where the songs don't feel fully fleshed out, fully realized? Are we just going to get snippets of tracks that could have been longer? I was not excited, to be honest. But this is one of those cases where you shouldn't judge an album based on your expectations, because clearly my expectations have been kind of trumped here. To my surprise, the runtime and track length actually have worked heavily in this album's favor, I must say. The album follows an incredibly lo-fi aesthetic across the entirety of this album. There's a very dusty, murky quality to all of these tracks. The instrumentals feel like they're coming from a different time period, you know what I mean? Like, this could have been the 90s where everything sounded a bit dirtier and a bit grimier. Earl's voice is not at the forefront of the mix. It's kind of buried at times. There are even times where it seems as though his voice is even lower in the mix than it's supposed to be, and then on some tracks it's a little bit higher, a little bit gruffier. And honestly, this could put a lot of people off. This isn't your typical rap album in 2018, but for me, some rap songs completely hits at every point. Like, this is an album I was not expecting at all, and I am in awe of all of it. I have a few nitpicky issues which I will get to, but this album, yeah, this is quite something. Earl Sweatshirt's delivery on this album is quite phenomenal. Like, the way he raps over these beats is so unique. I know he's always been given the MF Doom label over the years. He's similar to MF Doom with his style, but he makes it completely his own. I don't think the MF Doom label is fair at all. You could even say that this album has qualities that liken to Madvillainy. I mean, I can sort of see that with the instrumentals, the jazzy soulful samples, the really short snippet tracks, and his rapping style, his off-kilter rapping style over these beats. Yeah, you could see it as a very sort of comparison, like a low-key comparison to Madvillainy, but again, it's not really similar. The only similarity is the fact that these samples and beats are sort of muddy in their quality, and you've got an off-kilter rapper rapping over them with really introspective, detailed bars. But honestly, there are other similarities I'd throw in before I'd even mention Madvillainy. I would say there are underground artists like Mike that you could compare this to. Also a bit of Knowledge, the producer Knowledge, I think there is a bit of a similarity there too. And occasionally, this is probably just me and no one else would agree with this, but I get a little whiff of Milo, just a little bit, just in the way that Earl has that deadpan, spoken wordy delivery occasionally. Just gets me thinking of Milo, how Milo would always do that similar sort of rapping style on his tracks, just a little bit. So Earl has his influences, he really does, but this album is really nothing like anything that's come out in recent time. The absolute detail that goes into these songs, the metaphors, the complete emotions on his sleeve that come out in such a dark and twisted way is nothing alike anyone else out there right now. The imagery, the lyricism, everything about Earl and this music makes you feel like you're part of his mind. You're taking a look into what this man feels constantly, what this man has to go through. Very twisted blood metaphors on red waters, the harsh realization of the juxtaposition of cold summers. Summer being a very positive word and cold obviously implying negative implications. And on this track as well, the gun imagery that he crops up in his mind as well is all kind of worrying, honestly, to read about and think about. With lines like muffle my pain and muzzle my brain up. Oh, that is just, oh. The line as well where he says keep a noose hanging off my neck. Oh, that's such a deep line, because it's like, the depression's always lurking, it's always nearby, it never goes away, so the noose is just there, it's just right there, ready to strike, to sort of kill him off or something like that. It could also be a metaphor for the fact that he wears a chain, and the chain could represent the noose, and it's just so close by him that it could just choke him, but it's just not quite there. And with all this harsh and deadly imagery that crops up so frequently across the album, you must also commend Earl Sweatshirt here for never really glorifying it to the point where he's trying to make it look like it's cool to feel this way. I think this album is a good representation of showing the darker side of what it all really means. It's not about making it look cool or glorifying it to the point where you're romanticizing it. Like that would be completely wrong for anyone to do, but Earl never does that. Earl is a good sort of like mentor to like younger people, to show that I'm saying all of these harsh words, but this shouldn't be how you feel. It's not normal and it's not a good thing, and he never once puts it on this pedestal to make it look like a good thing either. And all of these tracks just have these great instrumentals to them as well. Like, you can't take away from these samples he uses, the absolute great, just soulful feel and this jazz sort of feel to it as well. Like on tracks like December 24 and On the Way, they just have such great instrumentals to the point where I'm like, I want them to carry on, I want them to keep going, but they just sort of cut off very abruptly, which is not the worst thing. I don't mind that they do that, but I just love the way they sound so much. I think that's also the beauty of this album as well, the way these instrumentals just kind of die off and fizzle out without giving you enough time to sort of digest what's going on. Because it was only when I was reading the lyrics to this album it occurred to me that I was trying to read through each like bar for bar, trying to catch up with what Earl's saying, sort of trying to analyze each little thing, and then before you know it, it's gone. The song is over, and we're on to the next thing. And it was at that point that it hit me. I realized, oh shit, that's the point. That's what these tracks are here to do. Earl is doing this on purpose. He's showing you that, yeah, there's no time to digest any of this because there's just so much going on in his mind that before you know it, it's the next thing. And you know, you don't have time to think about it. You don't have time to process it because it's just so harsh and soul crushing that there's just no time. It made me realize that that's what he's doing. He's showing us his mind. This is what's going on in his mind. It's all dizzying. These instrumentals are dizzying at points. His voice is muffled. Everything is just so hazy, and that's what this album represents. It's representing him, which makes it hit even harder, to the point where it makes it harder for me to just try and track down what these lyrics are meaning and what he's going for with the lyrics and the lines and the imagery on this album, because it's just so harsh to read about that it can take a lot out of you. I think Eclipse is a good example of where this album really just can really pummel you in a way that you don't expect, and it's with the outro lines. I'm just going to read off what he says here in the outro, where he says, "Say goodbye to my openness, total eclipse of my shine that I've grown to miss when holding shit in. Open my lids, my eyes said my soul's amiss. The signs say we're close to the end." The entire bit is just such an eye-opener, to the point where you just don't even think that, yeah, there must be a point where he feels like he just can't speak about things anymore because things have gotten way too much. You know, there was a time where he could tell people about things, but the openness has just been eclipsed. That last line just saying that, you know, the signs say we're close to the end. Like, you know, the end is coming, and, oh man, it's just, fuck. Luckily though, he does have some pretty positive lines on Azucar, where he states that, you know, there isn't a black woman he can't thank, is implying that, you know, there are women around him in his life that have been so supportive during the times of turmoil. And there is a line on this track as well where he says that his mum states that Earl reminds her of his father, which Earl is okay with, because, you know, Earl is happy that there is a man that he could look up to in his life. Even if perhaps his father might not have been all that great during his lifetime, it just makes you kind of find a nice glimmer of hope in the lyrics here. And the way that he can look up to his mum so much, and other women in his life have just been there for him when he's needed them. Even with that bright spark of a moment, it's still just an insignificant portion really to the entirety of this album, because there isn't really much in the way of happiness. There isn't much in the way of positivity, because everything else is just so negative. Knowing the fact that his father did die earlier this year, his uncle as well also died earlier this year. Both of these things happening in the space of like 3 weeks. You just can't fathom how that type of thing would impact someone. I mean, the guy is so young. He's 24 years old, just a year older than me, and he's had all this tragedy going on in the space of a year, and over a course of a few years. You know, of course, Mac Miller dying this year too. They were good friends as well. This takes me to the track Pino, because this was very divisive for me at first, because I didn't really like the recording quality of the track at all when I initially heard it. But then I realized while reading the lyrics, this track actually is an incredibly hard-hitting moment for the album. Sure, sonically it's a bit confusing to listen to, but I think that's the whole point of the track actually. I think it needs to sound this way because of the way he's talking about, you know, his thoughts and his depression. And there's even a line where he says, "This is not a phase." And it's such a true line, because it isn't a phase. Like, people think sometimes that stuff like this is just a phase. You're just going through something and it'll clear away. Don't worry, just be happy. But sometimes it's not as easy as that. I mean, I personally can't speak from my own experience, but just by, you know, talking about Earl Sweatshirt and the experiences he's had is proof that this clearly is something that's going to be ongoing for much longer than you would like to think, because even though he was making, making up more, how do I want to word it? He was starting to enter a better place in around 2015, but since then, more and more things have just hit him, and it's kind of just gotten worse from there. This track also as well, Pino referencing, the funeral of his father, and, fuck. Now prior to the track Peanut, you do have the track Plain Possum, which is a very interestingly structured track here, because on this track you have his mother reading a speech, while at the same time during this speech, his father is interrupting the speech by like reading a poem. Now apparently the plan was to have his father have this poem on the album and then show it to his father after the album had done and be like, hey look, I've got you on the album, this is a surprise for you. And unfortunately, before he was able to do that, his father did in fact pass away. So because of that, he instead included his mother here as a sort of thank you to her by, everything she's done for him, and also have his father reading off this poem at the same time. It just really hits harder when it goes straight into Peanut, where you see the inner workings of Earl's mind. Now if that hasn't destroyed you already, then we have more to come, because right at the end of Peanut he references his uncle, and then the closing track is a sample usage of his uncle's track from the 70s or 80s, I believe it is, because his uncle Hugh Masekela was a jazz artist. He closes the album off with this sample of Riot, and honestly it's one of my favorite moments because it just sends chills down me knowing the context of what this track means. And yeah, it sounds so beautiful as well. I just wish this could honestly have been looped for longer, but I do love the way it sort of stutters out right at the end and then just ends. It's just gone. All of this just occurs in 24 minutes. We just get such a deep dive into what's going on with Earl and everything that's just a part of his life right now. It's pretty hard hitting. Now I said before that the expectations going into this was making me a bit worried, because I thought, can this be a great album at just 24 minutes? 15 tracks squeezing into 24 minutes, will this work? And yeah, it did. It friggin' did, because I think if it went on any longer, I don't think it would have been able to hit as hard. I just like the way each track sort of ends off without really giving you much time to think about things, and then when you finally get around to thinking about it, you really have a lot to tackle. And yeah, to be honest, some instrumentals don't sound quite as good as others, I would say. I love Loosie, the instrumental on Loosie. I love the instrumental on December 24 and also Ontheway. Nowhere to Go is still a good instrumental. I think it works better in context with the album, but I wouldn't say it's one of my favorite tracks, to be honest. Mint, however, does sound a lot better now in context with the album. I think his flow and his delivery on this track really works incredibly well. It shows the talent he has, the way he can ride over these instrumentals. It's pretty crazy. As for other things I have issues with, I think the second track is definitely the weakest. I mean, it used to be Pino, but now I don't think that, because of the context of that track and everything that surrounds it. But the second track, I just think his voice is way too low in the mix. Like, I don't know why. I can barely hear what he's saying. It really takes me out of it a little bit. And as much as it adds to the aesthetic and the overall feel of the album, other tracks do it better than that track, so I just think his voice really needed to be up in the mix. So yeah, I guess I'm going to leave it here because I've been talking a long time and I don't want to over-explain everything here and get boring, but it's a pretty damn great album, really. I think an 8.5 out of 10 is the fairest I can go here because this is just such a great release. Finally in 2018, a popular hip-hop album has won me over, because this year hip-hop has kind of let me down way more than it seems to have with other people, which is fine. But I think right here we've got the best usage of a short runtime of an album, finally. It just works so well, and I think Earl's influences and Earl's usage of these samples and instrumentals is fantastic. So yeah, Earl Sweatshirt really did it with some rap songs. It's fantastic. Make sure you give it a listen. If you haven't, I'm sure you already have if you're a big music fan. If you have, let me know your thoughts on what you think of this album. Subscribe to the channel for more reviews if you haven't already. Have a good day.